Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. I'm Jonathan Capehart, associate editor at the Washington Post. Well, tensions between Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu are mounting as the president warns that the U.S. will halt offensive weapons shipments to Israel if Israel's military enters Rafah in southern Gaza. And the Israeli prime minister responded yesterday by saying, quote, "If we have to stand alone, we will stand alone." And this is happening as high-stakes ceasefire negotiations in Cairo were paused yesterday. Here to give us the latest, Yasmin Abutaleb, White House reporter for the Washington Post. Yasmin, welcome back to First Look.
Thanks for having me back, Jonathan.
Okay, lots to talk about. So when I interviewed President Biden on March 9th, he said a red line for him with Netanyahu would be an invasion of Rafah. On Wednesday, almost exactly 2 months later, Biden told CNN's Aaron Burnett that he would cut off offensive weapons shipments to Israel if the Israeli military invaded. And this comes after shipment of bombs to Israel was halted by the Biden administration. What is driving the marked change in posture on the part of the president?
I think just one important piece of context for how remarkable this moment is that President Biden has this really strong, visceral attachment to Israel in a way that not many Democrats these days do. So for him to take this step means he has really had it. He has exhausted every effort because what we know from our reporting is there were many people in his administration, many prominent Democrats who wanted the White House to take this step much sooner because of the high civilian death toll and the way Israel was conducting the war. I think what happened is there was a complete breakdown of trust between Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu has been openly defiant of President Biden's requests on a number of major issues throughout the entire war, despite unprecedented U.S. support. The U.S. has become more isolated globally because of its support of Israel in this war. And President Biden has said for months, including in the interview with you in March, he did not want them to launch a full scale invasion of Rafah. And what we know from our reporting is the US was offering to help Israel in a number of ways to evacuate Palestinians out of Rafah, to sort of clear the way so they could conduct this operation in a way that would limit civilian casualties. And Netanyahu has insisted he's going to forge ahead. And then, of course, one of the many complicating factors in the ceasefire negotiations was that Netanyahu said he was going to forge ahead with the Rafah invasion, regardless of whether there was a deal.
What was the White House's reaction, or what has the White House reaction been to Netanyahu's statement? If we have to stand alone, we will stand alone.
I think there was immense frustration because of the support the US has provided Israel throughout the course of this war. And they were very defensive yesterday. They were saying, we're still sending Israel weapons. We're still there for Israel's defense. We're still sending defensive weapons for the Iron Dome anti missile system. There are still weapons going to Israel. And I think one important piece of context here is that when Iran launched more than 300 missiles and drones into Israel in retaliation for an attack Israel had launched a couple weeks earlier, the US and its allies had provided the bulk of the defense against those missiles and drones. So I think there was this sense that there was a bit of arrogance that Netanyahu would say Israel can stand alone because Israel's been very reliant on the US throughout this war and in general. And that President Biden only took this step after repeated months long warnings that they did not want a full scale invasion of Rafah and would oppose it. I think they started saying this in February that they would oppose such an invasion.
As a result of Israel's operations in Rafah, ceasefire negotiations in Cairo stalled. Is the administration hoping this is a pause, or is it worried this marks the end of talks?
I think what the administration would tell you publicly is that they're hoping this is a pause. They have not given up. They still think this is the best path forward. I think there is a lot of skepticism that a deal can be reached between Israel and Hamas right now. These talks have been going on for months. I remember in January, President Biden was saying he hoped they were coming to an agreement soon. I mean, the first pause, which lasted 1 week, collapsed in November, and we have not had anything like that since. So I think there is pretty quickly dimming hope that some kind of deal can be reached. I think the White House will continue to insist publicly that they're going to keep trying. They still think this is the best path forward. Their hope, of course, which they have not made much of a secret, is that once you have a 4 or 6 week pause, you could lay the groundwork for a permanent end to the fighting. But it just does not seem that either side really wants that right now.
My follow-up was going to be, how close were they to coming to an agreement, but it sounds like they weren't very close at all.
It's so hard because we have not actually been able to see the text of the various agreements that have gone back and forth. So we're sort of reliant on what each side is saying, what the US is saying. What we know is that the White House's public posture was they felt the counter proposal Hamas offered earlier this week was not a huge gap from where they were. John Kirby said, I think on Wednesday of this week, that they felt like they could close that gap. They did not see this as a new proposal. They saw it as a counter proposal. That's not what Israeli officials were saying. They were saying this was a completely new proposal. This was a non-starter. So it's short of seeing the agreements. It's hard to know where the truth sort of
Mhm.
is. It seems the U.S. thought there was room for an agreement, but the two sides seem to have things they say are non-negotiable, and then there are of course those who will tell you neither of these sides actually wants a deal.
All right, let's talk about the impact of all this here at home. Speaker Johnson and the president were together earlier this week for a Holocaust Day of Remembrance, um, and it looked like here they are, very respectful at this very somber ceremony. But Speaker Mike Johnson didn't like the president's warnings to Israel, going so far as to speculate that Biden had, quote, a senior moment, quite a comment from someone who was a backbencher 6 months ago about a man who has been on the world stage for 50 years, including as chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Does the White House have any reaction to the speaker's comments?
They had a very strong reaction to it. One of the spokespeople, Andrew Bates, put out a statement, sort of, I can't remember the specifics of it right at this moment, but saying, maybe Mike Johnson doesn't understand what it's like to actually be in the middle of these things, but this was not a senior moment. This came after repeated warnings. So they had a very strong reaction to this. And I think Mike Johnson was reacting more to how Republicans have postured in the wake of this. You've seen for some time, especially as President Biden has been willing to ramp up his criticism of Israel and the way they're conducting the war, that they have tried to position themselves as the true defenders of Israel. Biden is caving to the left, and here we are, we're the true defenders. And that's exactly what they did when he made this very explicit threat on Wednesday.
It seems to me, talk about your reporting there at the White, excuse me, there at the White House, because as I watch all of these things happen, I think it's a mistake for people to view each of these things as isolated incidents. To me, the president's new red line, what Netanyahu is saying, and the stuff he's doing in Rafah, these are all part of a bigger thing that's happening. And to me, it's called negotiations and diplomacy. Is the White House frustrated that their colleagues on the other side of the aisle, Republicans, particularly Senator Lindsey Graham, who has been on the world stage as long as the president, and they used to be this close, they used to be best friends, that they don't seem to understand that there's a larger thing happening here.
I think there is immense frustration that, just like you said, Jonathan, these events are being taken sort of piecemeal rather than in context. And I think the really important thing to remember here is more than 35,000 Palestinians have been killed in the 7 months of this war. There is just a absolutely catastrophic humanitarian situation on the ground. The White House, the administration has pressed Israel for months since the start of the war on October 8th, when they announced that they were going to have a siege of Gaza, to let humanitarian aid in, because you're not supposed to use humanitarian aid as a negotiating tactic or as a weapon of war. So, I mean, it's kind of impossible to overstate just how awful the conditions in Gaza are right now. You've got a famine raging in northern Gaza. It's going to spread to the south at the rate things are going because Israel seized the Rafah border crossing where most of the aid was coming in. You've got disease, famine, a completely collapsed healthcare system. So with all of that, the U.S. Has tried over and over to do this sort of bear hug strategy that we've talked about before, where you try to refrain from criticizing them too much publicly in the hopes that you move them privately. But that has not worked, and it has not worked for several months. And so I think at this point, the Biden administration felt it had exhausted all other options. And like I was saying earlier, President Biden did not want to take this step, even though many in his party and many in his administration wanted him to do it much earlier. So I think at this point, they felt they had no other option to try to slow or stop a full scale Rafah invasion other than to make this kind of threat.
Yasmin, I want to thank you very much for reminding me and reminding everyone that one of the reasons why the president has been pushing so hard behind the scenes and now more publicly is the more than 34,000, 35,000 people who have been killed in Gaza, one, and two, that there is, according to the head of the World Food Program, Cindy McCain, there's a famine going on in northern Gaza. So that is pushing the president and his administration to bring a resolution there. One more question for you, because we're already going over time. This is how good you are, Yasmin. You get me thinking. This is on the economy. The president visited Wisconsin, which is a battleground state, and he went there to tout his economic record, announcing a $3.3 billion investment in an artificial intelligence facility. Talk about the significance of that site. Why did he go there of all places?
Well, this was a very political camp. I guess it was an official White House stop, but I think you could
Right.
argue it was a campaign stop as well because that was the site of the Foxconn facility that former President Trump had promised was coming in his first term and never really materialized. So President Biden, the White House, seemed to very much enjoy going to the site of where the Foxconn facility should have been, making a number of not so veiled references to what President Trump had promised. I think there was something about a golden shovel and digging himself in a hole, and there were a few sort of things. But he went there, I think, as you know, to show that Trump. What he's trying to show is Trump made promises that he never delivered on. President Biden has long said, you know, Trump every week in the Trump administration was infrastructure week, and nothing actually happened. The bill actually passed under him and a number of other pieces of legislation. So I think he was doing this. Well, I know he was doing this to very much make a point that he delivered on a promise he said he was going to, and President Trump didn't, and to remind people of that. And Wisconsin, of course, is one of the most critical swing states.
Right. I mean, it it's spectacular on so many levels. On so many levels. Yasmin Abu Talib, Washington Post White House reporter, as always. Thank you very much for coming to First Look. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Time for the opinions roundtable. So let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find Washington Post associate editor Eugene Robinson in the top box and Washington Post columnist George Will just underneath. Gentlemen, welcome back to First Look.
Thanks, Jonathan.
All right, so Eugene, let's start with Israel. Here's President Biden with that warning about halting shipments of offensive weapons to Israel on CNN on Wednesday.
Civilians have been killed in Gaza as a consequence of those bombs and other ways in which they go after population centers. And I made it clear that if they go into Rafah, they haven't gone into Rafah yet. If they go into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been used historically to deal with Rafah.
So, Eugene, what do you make of the president's new red line and public declaration here?
Yeah. Well, look, you know, there had been a lot of pressure from Democrats and from others for the president to take some sort of step to try to prevent a wholesale ground invasion of Rafah and the casualties, civilian casualties that will inevitably bring. I think both President Biden and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have come to a place that where neither wants to be. Joe Biden does not want to be standing and speaking in opposition to Israel, whom he has always considered, you know, one of the United States' closest and best allies. And Netanyahu, you know, whatever his preference might be for the Republican Party and for, you know, in general, he you know, no Israeli prime minister can seriously be on the outs with the United States, as you pointed out. It was really the United States know-how and equipment and planes that helped shoot down so many of those Iranian missiles. I mean, so this can't go but so far. But it's, you know, it has turned very ugly, and the central thing is those 35,000 casualties, and that's something that there's just this split on. I don't exactly see how it gets bridged.
George, and so what do you make of Netanyahu's declaration in response to what the president said on Wednesday, quote, "If we have to stand alone, we will stand alone"?
Israel was created after the Holocaust because it was not going to be the Blanche Dubois of nations. Blanche Dubois, you may recall, was the character in Tennessee Williams' Streetcar Named Desire, who repeatedly said, "I have always depended on the kindness of strangers." The Jews in Europe learned not to depend on the kindness of strangers, not to depend on anyone but themselves. That's the point of Israel. Now, when Mr. Biden says we're objecting to the strategy and tactics of Israel, they're objecting to more than that. They're really objecting to the war objectives, which is the destruction of Hamas. Intelligent people of goodwill can disagree about the wisdom of that objective, but that is Israel's objective, just as much as unconditional surrender was the objective of the US and its allies in the Second World War, which led to the firebombing of Hamburg and of Dresden and of Tokyo and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Tactics follow war objectives. It's going to take two things I'd like to hear from Mr. Biden. One is a definition of an offensive weapon. Artillery, how do you make that clear distinction in a case like this? Second, it seems to me there has never been more care taken in urban warfare than Israel has taken to try and spare civilian lives. The problem is that Hamas knowingly has embedded itself in a congested, heavily populated strip along the Mediterranean coast just so that it could act with a certain impunity, counting on the sensibilities of the West to flinch when Hamas's use of civilians as shields gets penetrated and put to the test.
Gene, I would love your reaction to what George just said.
Well, I mean, George, as usual, his analysis is brilliant, but Western sensibilities have flinched. The United States is kind of an outlier here, as many other allied nations have long since concluded that the method in which Israel is carrying out or is seeking to fulfill its objectives is killing too many civilians. And yes, it's a catch-22. Israel is being asked to do something that's probably impossible, which is if you are going to eliminate Hamas, and if Hamas is essentially using civilians as human shields, then what are you gonna do? I think the U.S. answer is that, number one, there are other ways to go about this. They would take longer, but we use the word surgical. I don't think there's ever anything really surgical about war, but more targeted ways of going about this. And second, I think the United States questions whether even if it does everything it's seeking to do, Israel will have eliminated Hamas. Especially in the sense that it could well be sowing the seeds of the next Hamas, which could be ISIS, which could be worse. And so I think there's a strategic a disagreement here as well.
Mm-hmm. One more question before we move on to the election. This is jump ball for the two of you. Has this war, the Israel-Hamas war, highlighted the limits of American influence in the Middle East, or does this, what's happening now, just basically highlight the tension between two specific men, between Benjamin Netanyahu and Joe Biden?
I'll take the jump ball here. Of course, His influence is limited. It's limited in the European Union. It's limited everywhere, and it always has been. What makes this a little different, Jonathan, is that we're dealing with a nation, Israel's sense of survival. It is surrounded by people rhetorically committed to eliminating it. They don't have Canada and Mexico and two broad oceans to protect them. They've got serious problems that are next door, literally next door. They live in a dangerous neighborhood, and there's not a whole lot the United States can do to make that neighborhood less dangerous.
Eugene?
Well, look, I've always been a big supporter of Israel, which is a great country in so many ways, and it is in a dangerous neighborhood. There is a difference now, though. Israel is, compared to its neighbors, Israel is very strong. Israel is not. I absolutely understand the sense of being surrounded and beleaguered, and indeed on October 7th, attacked in the most vicious way imaginable, just unthinkable ways. But this is not the Israel of 1967. It's not the Israel that of my youth. This is a very powerful, sophisticated nation with weapons far beyond those that any of its neighbors have. And I think far be it from me to tell Israelis how to feel about their existence and not to feel threatened, but it's a different country now from what it was, and I think people expect Israel to act in a different way.
All right, let's switch gears to the 2024 election because, George, you had a column this week defending a citizen's right to not vote. George, you wrote, and I'm quoting, 2024 is so abnormal. Consider, without necessarily embracing, an argument in defense of principled non-voting. Say what now, George?
The adjective matters, principled non-voting. Now, there's non-voting, an inertia arising from ignorance or lassitude or a general contempt for public matters. That's different. But elections exist. They are mechanisms for recording opinions, and non-voting in a principled way is an expression of an opinion. People say, well, you're morally obligated to vote for the lesser of two evils. No, you're not. You're not morally obligated really to vote in any particular way. But it seems perfectly clear that if enough Americans said the political system is not generating adult, serious, palatable choices, and we're going to leave the political marketplace until the suppliers of candidates, the two parties, do better, it seems to me that's a constructive approach to a destructive year.
Gene, are you on
Well,
board with George's idea? Because to me, a non-vote, principled or not, in this election is a vote for Trump and all the dangers to democracy that could come with the second Trump presidency.
Well, I certainly understand the argument. I'm not sure I would engage in it that way. I mean, I really look at elections as choices. And the fact is that unless something dramatic happens between now and November, we will have two choices on the ballot. There will be two people who will possibly be the next president of the United States. And I personally think it really matters which one of them is president for the next 4 years, of whether or not I think that person is my ideal candidate for the presidency. So I feel certainly obliged to make a choice, and I agree with you. I think that 4 more years of Donald Trump would be potentially disastrous, very bad for the country, very bad for the Western Alliance, very bad in a lot of ways. And so think people should weigh those two alternatives, and if they see great harm approaching from one direction, go the other direction.
I mean, to Gene's point, people should weigh those alternatives, and yet you could say that people haven't liked the alternatives that they've been given, because only about 66% of voting eligible Americans voted in 2020. And so I will get your response to Gene's response, but do you think that figure will grow or shrink this November?
I have no idea. It's not apt to grow much because the 2020 turnout was unusually high, arising from the dyspeptic feelings of the nation. But Gene says go one way or the other, as though there are only two choices. There's never a binary choice. That's all I'm saying. It an expression of opinion to say that this is just unacceptable to be presented this. Now, I understand Biden. Don't compare me to the almighty, to the alternative, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, we are not obligated to passively sit by and say, well, the political cafeteria has served up these two unpalatable dishes. Eat your spinach. I don't think we're required as adults to behave that way.
It's Salisbury steak day at the cafeteria.
Exactly. Well, there were days when I was in grade school that I sat down and I ate the liver and onions, and I don't like liver and onions, but they loved to serve it up. But I was hungry, and the alternative was that I wouldn't have anything to eat. So
yeah,
Jonathan, let me suggest, Jonathan, this is just a hunch, and I can't measure it. I have a feeling there are more people in this country today undecided between voting and not voting than there are who are undecided between Biden and Trump. Who is undecided about either of these two guys?
That's possible.
Okay. Yeah, on that, actually, George, I think you might be right. Also, for me, it wasn't liver and onions, Eugene. It was my mom's lunch that she would sometimes send me to school with peanut butter and jelly on pumpernickel bread. What kind of culinary hell was that? What's that?
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah, no, it was all kinds of horrible. Okay, so I'm going to close this out. All three of us have had the honor of winning the Pulitzer Prize. So I want to close with the Washington Post winning 3 Pulitzers on Monday, including a series by our colleague David Hoffman, now a 2-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize, about the rise of autocracy around the world. In one of his pieces, he wrote, quote, "The world's political prisons are bulging." Eugene, at the present moment, do you think is the global trend line favoring freedom/democracy or autocracy?
Well, there are a lot of headline examples of autocrats who are especially using technology to sort of advance, to sort of gain ground against the forces of democracy. I'm not sure if you really step back and look at the globe. Is this a more repressive world or more repressed world than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago? I'm not exactly sure that's the case. But so it'd be interesting to take sort of a broad view survey of that, and not just zero in on on Xi in China and on Putin and the examples that jump out at us.
And George, Ronald Reagan used to describe America as a beacon of hope around the world. Do you think that light has been diminished with the rise of autocracy?
No, because I don't think autocracy's risen in our country. I think we'd be a bit of a better beacon if we weren't, for example, trying to ban in TikTok, an app used by 170 million Americans, and if there were not a concerted effort afoot in the country to incarcerate the principal opponent to the incumbent president. But leaving that aside, I think our institutions are much stronger than they are sometimes given credit for, and I think the European Union grows stronger by the day. That the Orbans of Europe are considered really disreputable. I'm not quite as pessimistic as a number of others.
Just to be clear, George, you're not saying that President Biden is trying to incarcerate Donald Trump.
I'm saying that someone's trying to incarcerate Donald Trump. You decide who's behind it, but that there are people prosecuting him in the hopes of sending him to jail. It's not a controversial observation.
Well, it's true, but right now it's Alvin Bragg who's trying to incarcerate Donald Trump.
There's in the queue behind him.
George, I'm going to check in with you to see if your inbox is blown up as a result of this. George Will, Eugene Robinson, we're actually over time. Thank you both very much for coming back to First Look. Have a good weekend.
You too, Jonathan.
And thank you for watching. For more of these important conversations, how about doing this? Sign up for a Washington Post subscription. All you have to do to get a free trial is to visit WashingtonPost.com/live. You see it right there at the bottom of the screen. All one word, WashingtonPost.com. I should go this way, .com/live. I'm Jonathan Capehart. Thank you for watching Washington Post Live's First Look.